So now that we're done talking about contingencies, let's talk about some examples of stimulus' different dimensions. Visual. The red light on or off on a power strip. When it's not lit, I turn it on. The consequence is now there's power. Again, that's the visual dimension of the stimulus. There's that little red light. If it's on, I will not engage in the behavior of flipping it off unless I want it to be turned off. Or if that light's not on and I want it to be on, I will engage in behavior that will turn it on, which is to flip the switch, or perhaps to plug the cord in. There's smell. If the trash can smells, I take the trash can out. Consequence, it removes the smell. There's feel or touch. I get in a car and it's very hot. I turn on the air conditioning. The consequence is it gets cooler. Sound. Walking, I hear a car horn. I stop walking. The consequence is I don't get hit or run over by the car. So those are examples of stimulus' different dimensions. So again, a stimulus can have several different dimensions that we can use in programming. A stimulus prompt makes a stimulus more noticeable. It reminds people what to do or how to do it. It can be used as an antecedent strategy within ABA. So as an RBT, you'll be using stimulus prompts, where you make the stimulus more noticeable, or you make the person more likely to be able to choose the correct stimulus. It is an antecedent strategy because it's occurring before the behavior. Broadly, there are two types of stimulus prompts: within stimulus prompts and extra stimulus prompts. Within stimulus prompts changes something about the stimulus itself. Make it brighter. Maybe change its color. The point is that you're changing something about the stimulus. Maybe move it closer to the individual. An extra stimulus prompt is something in addition to the stimulus. It's outside, it's extra. So circling something, or when you're working with your patient and you point to something in a gestural prompt and you point to the item, that's an extra stimulus prompt. It's in addition to the stimulus. The point is, both stimulus prompts, we're talking about stimulus prompts, is it makes the stimulus more noticeable. Or it's telling us whether reinforcement is or is not available after it. Within stimulus prompts. Within stimulus prompts means that we're going to change something about the stimulus that indicates it is the correct item, or maybe perhaps that something's not available. If you're familiar with technology or how computers, web pages and stuff like that, if you see grayed out text, you will know that text, it probably means that clicking on that link or clicking on it is not available. It is a within stimulus prompt. They are changing something about the stimulus, the words. They're making the words less likely to be clicked due to the change in color. And that's only based on the history. Maybe perhaps if you think about the alternative. What if clicking on grayed out text did something really good? You'd be more likely to click on grayed out text. But because of the history of consequences, the learner's history with it, whereas clicking on grayed out text doesn't work, you are less likely to click on grayed out text. Again, the point I want to make though is that it's a within stimulus prompt. They're changing something about the stimulus. They're not adding anything extra. Now in the example right there in that picture, I actually have an extra stimulus prompt to illustrate the within stimulus prompt. That red circle, the red square, to show you would be an example of an extra stimulus prompt, right? I'm providing something extra so that you can see what I'm talking about. Here's another example of a within stimulus prompt. Let's say I'm working on letter identification, and my target item is R, and the QRP right there. By changing something about the stimulus, changing something about the R, making it blue, and if I have a history with that learner, that when the letter that I'm looking for, the target item is color, a different color, they're more likely to choose it. Again, I want to reiterate, there's no magic to it. There's no magic. Making the R blue doesn't really do anything. It's based on your history, your learning history, and how you reinforce that patient. If that patient gets used or gets reinforcement for touching the letters initially that are color, and you provide that consistently, they're going to learn that as a prompt. So there's no magic in the colorings the R blue. It just depends on your history of consequences with that learner. The point that I want to make, though, is that within a within stimulus prompt is that you're changing something about the stimulus itself. You contrast this with an extra stimulus prompt. This is something that's in addition to the stimulus. It's something extra that's added. Here's a couple of examples of extra stimulus prompts. So in that earlier example about the QRP, now I'm going to add an arrow. Instead of changing something about the stimulus, I'm just going to have something that's extra in addition to it. The arrow is an extra stimulus prompt. On the right side, you see a sign at a Little League baseball field telling parents or guardians some important information about acting responsibly. This is an extra stimulus prompt. The stimulus of being at a Little League baseball field and the additional stimuluses of seeing children play should be enough for people to act appropriately. However, if you've ever been to a Little League baseball game, if you've been enough times, you will notice that adults don't always act appropriately. Therefore, this league has established an extra stimulus prompt, a reminder for parents how to act. Or like here in California, when you're driving up past Valcaville, there's a stretch of road where it's really easy to go fast on. However, there's a lot of accidents there. So in addition to speed limit signs, you will see signs that say something to the effect of, is getting on time really worth your life? These signs are extra stimulus prompts for the person to slow down. Stimulus fading. A stimulus, maybe a prompt, is gradually decreased until it is gone. How can we implement stimulus fading? Reduction in the physical qualities of the stimulus. Visibility, physical contact, volume, etc. Let's look how we would fade back that extra stimulus prompt I had, the one with the arrow. So this would be an example of prompt fading. We're going to fade this extra stimulus prompt out. So we start out with it being just like it was, but then we can change the dimensions of it. We can make it smaller and smaller until it's gone. That would be fading out the extra stimulus prompt. Now let's look at an example of stimulus fading. There's a really good example of stimulus fading. We're teaching this individual how to do 7 minus 2. If you notice, there are people in the picture. Those people are stimuluses to help the person to look at and count to get the correct answer. And if you notice throughout the page, the stimulus is fading. They're becoming less and less apparent. The stimuluses were there to help promote the person to count to complete the math problems. But remember, we want the person to be able to respond to just seeing 7 minus 2. So we have to fade out the extra help. And that's exactly what this picture is showing. That is an example of stimulus fading. We are making the stimulus less and less apparent until we can totally fade it out. Stimulus fading can be used to get rid of prompts entirely, or it can be used to transfer stimulus control from one stimulus to a more naturally occurring one. What does that mean? Stimulus control transfer. This is done to transfer behavioral control from stimulus prompts to naturally occurring stimuli, or the SD. You are transferring behavioral control from one antecedent to a more naturally occurring antecedent. In this case, an SD, an instruction. This minimizes errors, and it is something that you're doing throughout the session. This isn't something you just say, oh, I'm going to do this. It's something you're always doing when you're systematically fading back prompts. You do this when you are running discrete trials, incidental teaching, chaining, basically any program, by fading back those prompts. You are transferring the control of the prompt to the more naturally occurring antecedent, the instruction. So to illustrate this, let's go back to our elephant example. When I say touch elephant, and the person touches the elephant because of that arrow, they are really touching the elephant because of that prompt, right? I'm giving them that hint. But as I fade that prompt back, and I still use the same instruction, touch the elephant, while I'm fading that prompt back, what I'm doing is I'm transferring the control of that arrow, the stimulus control, of them touching the elephant because of the arrow, to my more naturally occurring one, which is me saying touch the elephant. So as I fade that back, and then I can test it without the presence of a prompt, I can say touch the elephant, and if they are able to touch that elephant without the presence of that arrow, I can say that I've transferred the control of the stimulus, the arrow, to my more naturally occurring, me saying touch the elephant, the SD. I can say that the stimulus was transferred. Here's another example of stimulus control transfer. I see this used in classrooms a lot. Let's say we want a person to be able to recognize their name in written form. We would start by having their name and having an additional stimulus, a picture of themselves by their name. So once Simon here could identify his name with his picture, I would start to fade that picture out. So if you see in the top one, the picture is very clear, it's very bright. The second one, I'm starting to fade it out. I'm making it less and less bright until he could identify his name without the picture. I am transferring control of the additional stimulus, the picture, to the more naturally occurring stimulus, which is the name in written form. This is another example of stimulus control transfer, where we are taking a stimulus and transferring it the control of the behavior, here picking the name, to the more naturally occurring one, which is the name in written form. Notice how I faded it out over time. In applied behavior analysis, when we do things like fading or prompting, we do it systematically over time. We don't want to just take the picture away. So when I say we do something systematically, we do it in a stepwise procedure. We're doing it in consecutive steps. If we don't do things systematically, we might miss something. Or the behavior may stop occurring because now suddenly there was help and now there's no help. So again, in applied behavior analysis as an RBT, I want you to get used to that idea that we do things in a systematic fashion. It usually involves several steps. This is a really good example of that illustrates this.